Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Dean, and thank you very much to the Royal Society and RSSAf for hosting this, and to everybody who's here for your patience. I hope it won't be entirely in vain in listening to me. I did say to Dean when we were preparing this that I'm a terrible timekeeper, so I don't mind being stopped or told to hurry up. This is also slightly different, I think, from many of the Royal Society talks, in that I'm not going to be talking really from inside the discipline, but rather using one of my home disciplines to think about something more broadly, which interests me, and I hope it interests some of you. The short answer to the question, what is research capacity and can it be built, is I don't know the answer to either of those, but I'm going to tell you why. Okay, are you seeing the next slide, which is a story about research capacity building?
Yes, we are.
Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. I'm going to start off with a brief story. Among the other jobs that I have, I'm the convener of the PhD program in my department at Stellenbosch University. And I was contacted by a South African student who was studying in the global north. And he was collecting data in South Africa. And he had been told by this quite prestigious university in the global north that he must find a South African co-supervisor to work with him. So he came to the department and said, please find me a co-supervisor. So I contacted the supervisor of the student, and I said to the supervisor, will this person be a formal co-supervisor? What's in it for the person? Should we find such a person? Will there be a remuneration? Will their name be on articles? Essentially, what will they get out of the arrangement? And after something of a pause, the supervisor in this Global North University, I subsequently discovered was rather junior, wrote me a very kind letter explaining how this opportunity for this supervisor, and I had found the correct person, was that her capacity would be developed and would be built by this global university in the north, and that the colleague associated with my own department would be given opportunity to learn about international research and to liaise with international research associations. I'm sure that there are echoes of this story for everyone on this call. I'm just showing you, Google Scholar is the easiest one. I'm just showing the age index and list of citations for this person who allegedly had to have her capacity built. In psychology, an age index of 78 is almost unheard of. It's incredibly high, and this is internationally. The particular colleague is very well known at a range of international organizations, including World Health Organization and various UN organizations, and is in fact far ahead of the colleague in the global north. Sorry, there was a Freudian slip there, who is supposedly now going to build her capacity. So there's something in this story which would be familiar to many of us, but there's something in the story of research capacity building which links to broader issues around who's in, who's out, who has power, who has history on their side, and so on. And in my experience of research capacity building, and my hands are as dirty as anybody else's, these broader issues are issues that we tend not to think about, or certainly not sufficiently. So there are lots and lots of definitions of research capacity building, and I chose a particularly accessible and easy one. I think research capacity building supports individuals and organizations to develop and strengthen their research skills. These initiatives support researchers to develop skills that complement subject-specific expertise, ultimately enabling them to undertake and disseminate high quality research efficiently, effectively, and with increasing independence. Now, the entire research capacity building industry is skewed in a certain way. And it's skewed in relation to where scientific knowledge and power comes from. So I could have chosen any number of international academies. I happen to have chosen the Belgian one. I think that they put their objectives and requirements very clearly. It's interesting to see how they market their work on research capacity strengthening. It's with a very typical picture of an African abjection. And it's interesting that their society was renamed as the Royal Academy of Colonial Sciences in 1954, changed its name in 1959 to its present name, the Royal Academy for Overseas Sciences. We don't want to call colonial sciences, but it does raise a question about whether there are sciences which are typically overseas sciences, or whether we should be interested in science more generally. So I come from a disability studies background. It's the area in which I publish the most. And when I was thinking about research capacity, I immediately thought of the United Nations Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. One of the most contested articles in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is a very important international document, and it governs all aspects of society. South Africa is a signatory and has also signed something called the Optional Protocol, which means we are bound to operate at all levels, including in the research sphere in line with the convention. But one of the most contested pieces comes in Article 12, which is about equal recognition before the law. And it requires that states parties, that's a fancy name for saying countries, who ratify the convention, shall recognize that persons with disabilities enjoy legal capacity, and there's that word, on an equal basis with others in all aspects of life, and that these parties will take appropriate measures to provide access to the support that they may require in exercising capacity. So the issue of capacity, according to the United Nations Convention, is something that everybody has, but that it is incumbent on organizations like our universities, academies, and so on, to provide support that may be required in the exercising of capacity. And in fact, in Article 32, which is on international collaboration, I've highlighted the comment about facilitating and supporting capacity building. And in fact, they're using the word capacity building slightly differently from how they use the word capacity in Article 12. I won't get into that, but it indicates the extent to which the idea of capacity building is built both into our colonial position, but also into contemporary politics and particularly politics of change. And we've absolutely seen that within the current politics of science, we're at a very particular moment in Africa and South Africa and the global South more generally. So in 2022, there were two big global meetings on science. The first was the World Conference on Research Integrity, out of which came the Cape Town Statement, authored largely by Lynn Horn at the University of Cape Town and her colleagues, which really sought to point out to the international research community that there is research capacity in Africa, that this capacity is often not recognized, that there is inequity in global collaborations. Subsequent to the Cape Town Statement, there was a lot of interest in the statement in journals like Nature and The Lancet and so on, with The Lancet taking the position that it will no longer consider articles on health in low and middle income countries if there are not members of author teams in those countries stated as part of author teams unless the authors can explain why not. And so all of this sort of this language about discovering what we already knew in the South is very prominent at present, and obviously fits in with discourses around science and decolonization. But when we think about research capacity, I think there are some dilemmas that we really need to think about. I can't pretend I'll answer all of these, but how best do we recognize, value, and reward capacity that is already there? Some of you may know that the University of Cape Town chose to give an honorary degree to somebody who was part of the transplant team, a man of color who had never written any articles, but was very much involved in the world's first heart transplant, absolutely central to building that technology and building that science. But his name was nowhere, and later on UCT gave him an honorary degree. So linked to this is, how do we write, and is it possible to write, the injustices of skills and capacities, which, like the skills and capacities of that contributed to the original Barnard transplant team, how do we write the injustice of many skills and capacities are hidden, ignored, and invisible? We know very well from the history of science that the skills and capacities of women scientists, for example, are commonly hidden or ignored. But on the other hand, how do we recognize and take adequate account of realities of historical and current lacks of access and skills? And this is something I'm going to come to later, because I think this is a really tricky question. So what should we be trying to fix? And what is fixable? And what are the appropriate levels at which to think about capacity building, and at what levels are we mainly operating? And in this whole field, because it is such a complex political minefield, there are many, many tricky words, and I'm really not going to try and define any of these, but words that get sort of thrown around are words like equity, access, problems of epistemic exclusion, the wish to have epistemic justice, capacity, skills, redress, and reparation. And something else that's really not spoken about sufficiently, I think, is the issue of time. That there is something in the capacity building project, both as it's conceived of in Belgium, for example, and in the way that it operates in our own institutions, which has to do with trying to right wrongs which are historical and go back hundreds of years through 3-day courses or short courses or small engagements that we may or may not have with early career researchers, postdocs, and so on. These are very, very tricky words that I think we need to sort of think about. But if we go back to the United Nations Convention, is there something there that can help us? And of course, because I'm a disability studies scholar, I think that it absolutely is. And the question of what defines disability is a highly contested, difficult one, which I could spend ages and ages discussing with you. But if we look at the UNCRPD, the convention's definition, it's very simple. It says persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which, and it's my emphasis, in interaction with various barriers, may hinder their full and effective participation in society on, again, my emphasis, an equal basis with others. So the classic sort of canonical example from disability research is if somebody is a wheelchair user and is required to work in a building on the second floor, but there is no lift, that person is being disabled not by the fact that they're a wheelchair user, but by the inaccessibility of the building. So these barriers are often physical. As I've spoken of, they may be online barriers. Many of the websites that we use every day are very difficult to access for people with impairments. But underlying many of these barriers are attitudinal barriers, because I've seen this on many occasions. Even if you think about the built environment, where it's much cheaper to build a building even though it's required in building regulations to build a building with a ramp in South Africa, it's much cheaper to build an unsafe ramp that's at the wrong that's at the wrong angle and hope that you don't get caught, than to build actually a safe ramp. That's just one example. So Alan Yeti and his colleague said a long time ago that the thing about disability is that we tend to think about disability being within people, but in fact, disability is a relational construct. The disability operates between the person with the impairment and what's going on in society. And for certain purposes, the person with a particular impairment may be disabled, and for other purposes, they may not be. And what I want to argue, quite similarly following this, is that capacity is also a relational construct, or it should be. And one of the problems that I think we have about capacity building is we tend to think of it as placing something into a person's individual capacity, when in fact we should be thinking much more about relationships. And I want to illustrate this from an example of some disability-related work that I conducted quite a long time ago in Southern Africa, but really affected how I think about capacity building, disability, and so on. And it was a project led by the Southern African Federation on the Disabled, who needed a Southern partner. They work in 10 Southern African countries, and they had an extremely ambitious agenda. They said they were going to develop an approach to build institutional capacity for the organization, which would enable the organization to design, drive, and deliver their own program, focusing on key issues. And I was lucky enough to be the trainer of 20 trainees from 10 Southern African countries with widely varying qualifications and experience. Some had completed high school, some had master's degrees. And we met for 3 years and did what I think looks like a fairly standard capacity building program on interviewing, reporting skills, and so on and so forth. We managed to report output, so it looked like we built all this capacity. The candidates who passed received short courses, certificated short courses from Stellenbosch University. A number of the people went back to their own organizations. Some went on for further study, changed the record keeping in their organizations. Some are now studying up to PhD levels. And I think we learned a lot from this process. But there were also challenges in the process. The vision of the organization was it was going to be a powerhouse repository for research. It didn't have a university infrastructure. It had no internet. But the international agencies, absolutely loved this and put money behind what I think was essentially a pipe dream. The late Alexander Perry, who was Secretary General, known nothing to some people on this call, and a role model in my life of the South African Federation of the Disabled, kept this whole organization together. He died young, partly related to lifestyle-related issues, and the program fell apart. And I think that one of the issues around capacity building that's not thought about is how individual often the kinds of relationships and networks are in the global south. I'm constantly reminded when I work with partners from the global north how much infrastructure they have. And on the question of infrastructure, I was tremendously pleased that we were able to access very nice laptops for all of the participants. None of them had laptops. It's very hard to do training these days when people don't have access to laptops and the internet. The laptops are somewhere, I don't know where they are. At that time, the organization was based in Zimbabwe. The laptops disappeared somewhere. I don't know if they're in Zimbabwe, but they never got laptops. One of the things we did learn, though, was that people do have capacities we hadn't realized. So one of the exercises that is very common in community work and in research capacity building is community mapping. And I was very careful to make all of my work accessible to the large number of blind people that we had working on the program. And they started laughing at me because they were saying, why are you concerned with making everything accessible to us? Don't you know that the best people to tell you about what the geography of African cities looks like are blind people? Because anybody who travels a lot in Africa and in South Africa will know there are potholes, there are sewers, there are all sorts of things. Blind people have to know this. And so we tell one another exactly what a city looks like in a way that sighted people will never see. They in fact had capacities that I wasn't aware of. Similarly, and unfortunately, though, the brightest person by quite a long way, in my view, on this course was somebody who had had about 7 years of schooling, had stopped going to school by rurality, being a Black disabled person in a low-income country, had an incredibly good understanding of research issues and about the importance of being able to make things strange. He will never, although he was the best student and got his qualification, he will never be able to write a research report on his own. I think the backlog in terms of his literacy skills is just too great. What other things that we learned through the process was that many people in the global north talk about independence for people with disability, when people actually don't want that. People want to be interdependent, and our local African ideologies are really important, I think, when we think about capacity. And Eva Kite, who's a leading disability studies author, talks about what it means to be human, is to be interdependent. So building communities of practice are very important. And other things that I had kind of discounted as a sort of hard-headed empiricist, issues of faith and how faith keeps you going for the long haul, but also how important it is to recognize what's not going to be fixed very quickly because of these long legacies in people's lives, but also historically. So we developed this triangle of engagement and community-based research capacity building. Primary interest in empirical research is what's going on, but we also need to think about how do we change things, how do we change people's minds, and questions of faith, actually, which for me as an atheist is particularly challenging. But how do we have faith to keep things going? And some key questions that I think we all had to engage with through this project was the loss of optimism associated with an overambitious research project, the question of lack of resources and how we deal with that, the performative demand that came from funders who kept on saying, you must teach in an appropriate, you must build capacity in an appropriately African way. Do you know this other project has used puppets? There was a constant pressure on me to have puppet shows and to use a range of techniques of participation, which I think would look good on the brochure of these various international aid agencies. But actually, I don't know how to teach blind people Excel by having a puppet show, for example, which is one of the things that we did. One of the fundamental ideologies of the organization was everybody is a researcher. In some ways, it's trivial because we're all researching, we're all trying to find out things about life. It obscures realities of different competences that we've learned. But there's also something quite profound, I think, about this when we think about capacity building. And in my experience, certainly working with a range of people, most of them hadn't gone further than high school, was that in terms of understanding what it means to be a researcher, researcher is somebody who's able to make the world strange and to not take things for granted. Their histories of exclusion in a whole range of ways have made them to be inquiring, asking questions in a disciplined way, in a much more fundamental way than many of my more privileged students at Stellenbosch University, who are graduate students, have have had to do. So yes, we are all researchers in some senses, and in other profound senses, we are not. So I'm going to move on, because I took those lessons forward. And when I say it's never just me, it's always lots of people into other work. And I was asked to be the founding editor-in-chief of the African Journal of Disability, which is now a much better journal than it was. As soon as I left, the journal became much better. It's now run by my valued colleague, Professor Jiketse Ned. And it really has gone from strength to strength. But how do we assess that this is a strong journal? Well, the credibility of this journal, which was supposedly built by and for Africans, is determined not by its activist impulses, but by essentially global North criteria. So the fact that we were able, within a very short space of time, to get indexed on PubMed and Scopus trumped everything else that we were trying to do at the journal. And we were trying to do a lot of things. We never, when the journal was young, rejected any submission first time. We tried to help every set of authors to develop their papers into something. And one of the things that involved sometimes was if reviewers thought there was something of potential in the work, but the authors themselves had been excluded from the advantages that the reviewers had, we would, with the permission of both the author and the reviewer, we would break the confidentiality, and the former reviewers would now become co-authors on papers with activists and so on. I'm really proud that we did that, and really grateful that we got a lot of support from very well-established researchers, particularly early on in the journal, both in this, but also just in publishing in a journal which doesn't have an impact factor and was not at that stage on the DHET list. One of the challenges that I faced was that every single time I had to ask a potential reviewer from the global North to review for us, I had to deal with the assumption that because we're an African journal, we must be predatory. I got very tired of doing this, even though I had sort of standard text that I used, but people would still come back and say, it's clear, you can't be a real journal, and so on and so forth. So we're dealing with a range of exclusions and prejudices there. And just one story from a rather weak, in fact, Global North author who got some quite harsh reviews for his submission, which wasn't very good. And there was a long backwards and forwards. He didn't actually know that all his reviews were actually from the Global North. But in the end, ended up saying to me, I have given you a favor by giving you this wonderful article, and you are using reviewers who clearly don't know what they're talking about. They happen to be, world experts in this particular field. But the assumption that I should be grateful to somebody from the Global North for publishing in Africa just reinforces some of the politics that we talk about when we talk about capacity building. Now we're coming on to the South African Journal of Science, which is much more well established. It's our 120 years. Look for our special issue and all the exciting things that we're going to be doing. And I have to say that when I came on to the journal, I've been there just over 3 years, I came into an incredibly strong team with a great deal of capacity and skill, many of which are quite hidden actually from the front facing of the journal. And partly people are very shy, but it's partly also a structural thing which has to do with a range of issues around class, gender, etc., and so on. I'm the old white male elephant in the room. So in the history of the journal, it's been going 120 years. For 18 months, we had an editor-in-chief who was a white woman. The rest of those 120 years, every single editor-in-chief has been a white man. And this has it continues to be a very live issue for us. And I can't go into all the ways in which we're dealing with this. But when I came into the journal, there was already an associate editor mentoring program to bring in younger researchers and to increase diversity, and we've expanded on that. And for me, but as editor-in-chief, one of the most exciting things about the journal is its interdisciplinarity, but it's incredibly challenging. I would imagine it's challenging for anybody as an editor-in-chief, because you can't be an expert on all of the fields, but we have associate editors to deal with it. But I think particularly for a psychologist and one who has such odd interests such as disability studies. So it's been really interesting for me. So some observations, which after 3 years, and I'm just putting an advert in there for all the food scientists, please send us some submissions. I am generally able, when I get a submission, I don't look at the name of the author. I don't look at cover and letter. I don't look at the title page. The first thing I look at is the blinded submission. And I can more or less, without fail, predict what kind of institution and the history of that kind of institution to which authors are affiliated. So authors who are affiliated to historically strong research institutions in South Africa do not make the same kind of rookie errors that other authors don't. This is not about people's individual capacity. It's about where they are. I've also found in relation to this that, as I mentioned, I'm not a subject expert, but my own basic literacy and numeracy can generally lead me to predict whether an associate editor is going to think that something is worth being sent for review or not. So I don't think any of our associate editors online here, but they'll know when I send a note saying, what do you think? I like it. They tend to like it as well. And what do you think? I'm not sure. They tend to be not sure as well. So that there are generic skills which are common to writing in scientific journals. And then every single week of my life on the journal, I am faced with the desperation of inexperienced authors from all over, largely Africa and Asia, not only, but who offer sometimes to pay me large sums of money to get to get their work published in my journal, as long as I can do it by next week. I'm tempted, but so far I have not said yes. But I find it actually incredibly upsetting, because clearly there are these pressures which look like pressures to build research capacity in Africa and Asia, but are actually about chasing particular kinds of outputs. And because we are the leading interdisciplinary science journal in Africa, we get this. I haven't had this. I mean, I work on other journals. I mean, this is unique to the South African Journal of Science to have this, all the time. So we try and do a range of things to help capacitate researchers. And Gemma French, who's one of our associate editors, written a lovely piece which you can look at about our workshops. We tend to have 6 monthly workshops on how to publish and peer review. And we have monthly open sessions, which have been quite amazing. And Gemma has put the main sort of questions in her article, in her commentary, that people ask. They are such, in some ways, simple questions. They are not questions about research. In some ways, they're questions about, if you like, intellectual social capital. And the saddest story that I just want to tell you is one researcher who had not sent an article to a journal for 2 years, was very worried about the quality of her work and so on. And we said, why? And she said, well, there's this thing called ORCID, and I don't know what an ORCID is. I don't know how to get it. I don't have money to get it. It took, those of you who are researchers on this call will know that it takes 3 minutes to get an ORCID ID. She was able, after 2 years of sitting in quite a research-intensive university, actually, in South Africa, she was able to submit her work for publication. I think we completely underestimate the politics of exclusion. So we are trying to change the context at the journal. We have our mentoring project. We have an inclusive language policy, which we hope, as Marina Hubert, the science communication expert, always says, we hope helps us clear things up rather than dumb them down. Recently, Cielo, which is an organization of various journals, some of you on this call will be familiar with, had its 25th anniversary in Sao Paulo, and they invited me as the editor-in-chief to talk at their conference on capacity and change and equity. And we said no, from South African Journal of Science. We are not sending the old white man. And I'm very pleased that Dr. Nkosinathi Madondo, who's one of our mentees, kindly agreed to go there, indicating that these are not just questions in theory, but have to do with practices, who gets to move about in space, and so on. On what used to be called Twitter, but now is called X, we are posting similarly on Facebook in a range of South African languages, largely Zulu and Afrikaans at present, not because we are planning to necessarily to change the language of the journal, though we are thinking about changing how we do our abstracts and whether those are going to be in multiple languages and so on. Not because we're trying to do that, but to give messages about inclusion, that we actually care about the fact that there are people who are first language, other languages than English, which is so well dominated. And we've been working together with the science communication chair at Stellenbosch University, thinking about publishing through sorry, I'm hearing, is someone trying to say something to me? No, okay. Publishing in auditory format, which will also increase our accessibility. And it's actually much more complicated than you'd think. But I'm particularly interested in the politics of desperation, what it may feel like not to be capacitated and to need one's capacity built. I think that it's certainly quite well established that we conflate metrics with capacity. So we look at university rankings, we look at NRF ratings, and in fact, universities have a lot, I think, to account for in this regard. We are tending to outsource assessments of quality of research and researchers to the NRF, to publication in so-called top journals in the global north, when everybody who's ever published knows that quality is not the only criterion for publication, to put enormous pressure on PhDs and postdocs to shoulder the load so that the university rankings will go up. And this is something Chrissy Bowie did a guest editorial for us late last year, to implement what I call push-up production models of getting PhDs into the system. It's really hard to fail a PhD in many disciplines. So part of what's happening is that we're getting a generation of people with, I think, PhDs which could be much stronger, but they're done very, very quickly. The problem with that is not with them, but with the potential knock-on intergenerational effects, where people who themselves have not had time to develop skills themselves become PhD supervisors. And I think it all relates to these problems of metrics. So I've sort of told you in many words what I think capacity building is not. It's not handing all our work over to graduate students and postdocs and expecting them to get on with it without support. I run the early career academic development program at my university, and I've done quite a lot of work with postdocs as well. And many postdocs have said versions of suddenly you're on your own as you get thrown into a lab and are expected to do all the work and all the writing. Capacity building is not ignoring the hidden work and competing demands. It's not expecting others to achieve things which you yourself do not fully understand. I've recently had an engagement with a university, not in South Africa, but this happens in South Africa, where a requirement for a PhD is there must be 2 publications in a first or second quartile journals. Now, particularly when you work in social sciences and in the social science faculty, it's the Q1 and Q2 journals anyway tend to be dominated by people in North America. To convince people in North America about contextual issues, about, for example, processes of marriage and divorce in a low-income African country, why that should be of interest to a range of hotshot researchers in the United States, it takes actually a lot of work, and a lot of work that very weak researchers in the United States do not have to think about. To make
Leslie, we've got about 5 minutes to go, please.
Thanks. That's perfect. Thanks for telling me. To make matters worse, the supervisor of this particular student has never published in such a journal, and in fact has published, as far as I can tell, outside their country only in predatory journals. So capacity building is not separate from relationships and teamwork, and it's not something that you can easily outsource to trainers or to experts. And it can't be something that you can do in a workshop. If you want to know how to ride a bike, you've got to actually get on a bike and ride a bike. Now, I'm definitely part of the capacity building industry, which I think will grow with the casualization of the academic workforce. And in fact, I have a vested interest in people never being developed, because I want to keep building their capacity because I like it. But for inexperienced researchers, capacity development may make demands on time and resources that could be better spent on doing the work. And there are, I think, some quite avoidant younger researchers who go from course to course to course, rather than actually getting on the bicycle and falling off the bicycle of actually doing research. We have to speed up somehow to make up for the past, but the bigger picture is really serious. On your right, I mean, these are some of the Pearls data that Nick Spall has analyzed about the literacy levels of our grade 4 learners. When that is a pipeline, we're in big kind of trouble, and all scientists need to be thinking about this and not just thinking about capacitating the people in front of them. We have to have very clear questions about what we can achieve and what is not achievable, and about the next generations after generations that we have very lightly capacitated. And we need to talk and think together about ghostwriting. I'm sure every senior academic on this call has done a little bit of that. It's not ethical. It looks like capacity building, but it isn't. And I've certainly had experience of, helping people more than I should have with writing, and those people have gone on to become supervisors, and they actually they haven't developed the skills that I should have taught them. It was much easier for me to kind of get this chapter out in the book or get this article out or whatever. So it's much easier to individualize the issue of research capacity building than to think about the organizational and political dimensions of a changing construct. We have to think about authoritarian practices in organizations, especially where people in higher echelons do not feel confident about their own skills, about more senior personnel actually not wanting all these opportunities to work for younger personnel because they didn't have them, and the disconnect between the metrics of success and what it takes to establish a career. I am coming to the end. This has not got to do with capacity building directly, but I don't know how many of you have read the work of Jennifer Palka, but she says in the business world, they say that culture eats strategy for breakfast, meaning that the people implementing the strategy and the skills, attitudes, and assumptions they bring to it will make more difference than the most brilliant plan. In government, culture eats policy, even when legislators and policymakers try to give implementers the flexibility to exercise judgment. The words they write take on an entirely different meaning and have a very different meaning as they descend through the hierarchy. And she says becoming more rigid with every step. That's not my experience, but I think the point that she's making about how organizational culture and the culture of universities and of the science system is absolutely key and is separate from what we have on paper in policy documents and so on. I think that's absolutely key. If capacity building is individualized or seen as inevitably good in itself, I've had this out, oh, Leslie, you're so wonderful that you're going off here and going off there and doing this training and that training. It's not enough. if we cut it off from context, it can even make matters worse, because it allows us as institutions to tick the box of training or mentoring, and we can say we've done that, and it stops us looking at structural issues. So similarly, Sue McKenna has a wonderful poem in the latest South African Journal of Science, and she talks about wellness. You know, if I want wellness in my university, I do not want a fun run, even though the wellness department can then tick off they have done wellness. I want people to be treated well. I want them to get properly paid. I want the workforce to be unionized, etc., etc. So there's serious questions we can ask about what we can and what cannot do. And the performance of capacity development, the puppet show part, helps us not think about big questions. And from disability studies, we have to think about you know, whether we are assimilating people into existing organizations or whether we are actually building truly inclusive organizations. So a proportion of what we call capacity is not about skills. Skills are really important. It's about things like confidence. It's about networks that include and work for you. It's about comfort with mistakes and having fun in a suitable career. And I don't think this is built by metrics or training, but it's built through ongoing supportive, appropriately challenging relationships in which teams and organizations work together and through relationships of mutuality. And sorry, I went slightly over time, but I'm looking forward to some discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Leslie. That was very interesting and a very different viewpoint from my own point of departure as a biochemist that spends a lot of time in the laboratory. There's one or two things you said that I really struck home to me. One was when you receive, you do not reject items that you receive in the journal for the first time. Could you just expand on that a little bit so that I could understand it better?
Sure. Sure. You know, this was with the African Journal of Disability. We tried not to do any desk rejects in the beginning, but to try and engage with the authors and to help them, if they showed a very low level of skills, to provide ways in which they could develop the skills so that they could send us something that would have potential to be sent out for review. It can't be done with every journal. We can't do it with South African Journal of Science. But it largely had to do with attaching people to networks of people who could help them. And some of the questions that would come up from these very poorly written, easy desk reject pieces were questions that nobody else was asking, nobody else was researching. So we got some really interesting papers that we hope I've made that clear now.
And the sort of level of success you got with the approach?
Mixed. We still ended up, you know, rejecting quite a number of pieces, but and I don't have the current figures on the rejection rate of the journal, but there were certainly some standout pieces which would never have been published without that help, and also standout pieces which really helped take the field forward, because the content was there, but the writing skills and so on were not.
Thank you. If you'd like to put your hands up or put a question in the chat, there are some comments in the chat that perhaps I'll start off with. Sue McKenna says, I've never thought of breaking the blind peer review system to bring reviewer and author into collaboration. This seems like something we could consider more widely. And I think that's a really, really interesting approach as you've described in your talk. Do you like to comment any further on it?
No, I mean it was kind of. I mean, thank you. Sue. I mean, it was kind of through desperation, actually. Where I mean, I was dealing with a particular article, and I absolutely loved the content, and I knew that nobody had done research on this in the world. It had to do with, for those who are interested, it had to do with access to transport in African cities for people with disabilities, but with hearing and speech impairments. We often think about, you know, the difficulty of getting a wheelchair onto a bus or a taxi, but we tend not to think about those kinds of things. And it kept on coming, backwards and forwards, a couple of rounds to the reviewer who was saying, you don't understand the terms that you're using, you're not using your statistics correctly, and so on. And it was through desperation that I thought of it, but it ended up being actually, obviously it has to be done with permission of both parties, but we have a number of cases where it's been incredibly enriching for both sides. I mean, I wish we could use it more.
There's another comment in the chat. Please put your hands up if you want to make a verbal contribution, or put them in the chat. There's a comment in the chat that I'll read out. I recently learned about the citizen-generated data movement that is supported by the UN Stats Commission. It is about people on the ground building data sources, and using these for advocacy and setting priorities. It builds a leadership of people on the ground. This seems to be an interesting and positive move to building capacity outside the academic context, but may influence it.
Yeah, thanks, Margie. I mean, it links to the whole participatory statistics and participatory epidemiology movement, which I think is incredibly helpful. And I think I'm also very much influenced by, my age and my position in the academy. And I also think that as relationships between the academy and outside organizations become much more fluid and flexible, these kinds of partnerships, I think, will be really helpful.
Rob Dreenan has got a spelling mistake, but I'll correct it for him. Oh, he's corrected it in the next message. We learn through trial and error, but our fast-paced work now, this mode is no longer efficient enough. This capacity development is an imperative. Your thoughts, please.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand. We do learn through trial and error. Yeah, I mean, I think the issue of time, which I mentioned, quite briefly, is an absolutely central one, and I don't have an answer for time efficiencies. I mean, I've certainly seen, and I'm sure this is common to everybody else, I've seen in my own university how we're expected to do more and more with less and less, fewer and fewer resources and less time. And I do not understand a shortcut for this. But one of the things that I think has been very helpful in my own work, particularly on academic writing, is actually sitting and writing with people, all in the same room at the same time. So the writing's getting done, but we're not sort of teaching people how to write. But I really don't have an answer for this, and it worries me as it worries you. Sorry, I can't be more positive on this issue.
Sue McKenna's raised another interesting point. I'm increasingly of the view that we need to get rid of direct funding for publications at a national level. Definitely of the view it should be abolished at institutional level, and that publication requirements for PhD is unethical. I think this will enhance the quality of research and the potential for research developments. And she'd like your thoughts, please.
Okay, I mean, I have to declare that I'm one of the people at Stellenbosch University who argued very strongly over a period for 10 years for PhDs by publication. But I actually agree with you that a publication requirement for the PhD is unethical, because anybody and there are many people on this call who are journal editors, anybody who's ever been a journal editor will know that the criteria that we use to assess whether something enters a journal is not simply academic quality in some sort of abstract sense, and that's really what we're trying to do with PhDs. It has to do with fashion. It has to do with when we had something last week. There's a huge bias towards the global north, because it's not just a publication requirement, but it's in particular kinds of publication. I think, in my experience, particularly working with PhD students from other institutions in other African countries, I think it's really, really helpful to have to work together with PhD students through the process of preparing something for publication, getting rejections, and so on. I think that is useful. But I do not believe that it is ethical to require somebody to have had something published in order to get a PhD, to show possibly for some kinds of PhD that they are able to understand that system, I think is a useful skill. But I completely agree that's unethical. And, you know, I gave the example of, you know, these students who have to publish and the people who are supervising them have never done that. But even if the people have, I don't think it's right. And I agree with you.
Yes, I think to supplement that, I'd also add that a lot of the training takes time, and to put the idea of having a publication negates and ignores the fact that lots of training in different fields just takes time. And as a supervisor, I want to have a student that is appropriately prepared, and documents when submitted may take another year or so in some fields to get published. And I think that's vastly unfair, and as you say, unethical for us to put these impositions on students. There's a question from Zara Trafford. Zara, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Leslie. Thanks again for another wonderful talk. First, just to say, I think, you know, a real lesson that we are lucky enough to learn from you is that even though you have all of the strong skills to back it up, you also have a lot of humility and honesty about the ways in which corners are cut, I suppose, when we are under the demands of our work environments. And so I think that that's helpful because it also opens up spaces for the rest of us to reflect more honestly on our own behaviors. I wanted to ask you about, if you could just speak a little bit about what the dynamic is like between Northern and Southern journals. Because I know a little bit of what it's like to try and write to a Northern journal as a person working from the South. And as you talked about a bit, sometimes they're just not really interested in us trying to establish, you know, deeper contextual arguments. So there's that side of the picture. But, you know, talking about approaching reviewers and being considered a predatory journal just because you have Africa in the name. And then also, like, what is it like at a kind of international level for the editorial board? Are there spaces for kind of chief editors to connect with one another around these things? I guess I just thought I'd ask you to reflect on that a little bit. Just in terms of correcting those power dynamics, I think is what I was getting at.
Yeah, I mean, internationally in the publishing world, in fact, as I said, now is our time. Everybody's talking this issue, in fact. And a lot of international journals are kind of international. I mean, Global North. When I always use the example of the Malawi Medical Journal, which is an excellent journal, but none of us would call it international, even though it is. There's a lot of scrambling actually to get more representation and so on. I mean, what I didn't say for purposes of this talk is I'm the editor-in-chief of the Scandinavian Journal of Disability Research, which is a Global North journal. I think, you know, the reason they wanted me was you know, precisely because I can give a kind of different kind of perspective. And a number of the publishing houses are kind of looking at these, bigger publishing houses are looking at these issues as well. Although I must say that some of the more factory models of huge publishers are, I think, to some extent exploiting researchers in the global South by giving them titles and as being associate editors on their journals and giving them huge amounts of work to do. But I think there's a lot of goodwill in this. I mean, the fact of the matter is that for any journal to survive, it has to be able to talk to its readership. Its readership tends to be the people historically who've been writing in that journal. And does it irk me that it is possible, certainly in psychology, which is a very contextual field, to get published in a first, you know, Q1 journal without ever stating properly where you collected the data, what the social context was in a discipline which is, you know, very fundamentally social and contextual. That's fine if you're in North America. It's you won't get away with it if you're publishing from the global south. You have to locate yourself in a different way. But I think there is a shift. I think that the cultural encapsulatedness of what is often called the World Journal of this and the International Journal of that is starting to break down. And it's starting to break down partly because there's been activism from RSSAf, from various other southern organizations around these issues. So if we want to build capacity here, we've also got to make sure that we improve the capacity of those international journals as well. I mean, yeah, no, I've said too much on that, probably.
Thanks, Leslie. I'll ask you all my other questions quietly somewhere else.
We have time for one more question. There's one in the chat from Gemma Finch. What about the role of mentorship and capacity building versus workshops training? I have the perception that early career researchers and young staff who work closely with a strong mentor appear to be highly successful. Of course, not everyone has access to a strong mentor. This may be more limited to more advanced institutions, and it may be difficult to scale this up.
I mean, I completely agree with Gemma. That a strong mentor who cares about you and is nice and all of those sorts of things, while at the same time demanding and so on and so forth, is incredibly important. And often for historical reasons, many of these people are in more advantaged institutions. It also takes time to come back to another issue that has been raised, and the problem I believe, and this is informed by relational ethics of care, which I mentioned very briefly in my presentation, is that we build good research and good science through a range of skills, but also through relationships. I'm thinking particularly of a very good engineer that I know, who's not only excellent in the lab and so on and so forth, but is just incredibly kind. And part of the problem is that it is so time-consuming and tends to be associated with particular people, particular histories and departments and institutions and so on. And then there are always these moves towards, let's do a scale up, let's put this all online, let's give people resources they can read, all of which are incredibly helpful. And I've done a lot of my further training in statistics and so on by sort of going through online excellent epidemiology courses and so on. But those are not enough, and it's that not enough that really concerns me. We cannot reduce everything that we're talking about just to learning a range of skills, because learning happens in relationships, in my view anyway.
I think that's a nice note to finish off. Leslie, it's been a pleasure listening to you and hearing your thoughts. Thank you very much for answering all the questions that were put to you. Must remind people that this talk is recorded, so if there's things you think you missed, you can always go to the Royal Society's website to have another look. On behalf of the Royal Society and those of you that are here today, thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you for your questions, for the chat. There was a very interesting discussions that were generated as a result of it, which we very much appreciate. And then lastly, thank you very much, Leslie, for such an erudite and very interesting talk that certainly has me as a biochemist thinking very differently to what I was thinking about an hour ago. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.